And I'm pleased and honored to announce that 2018 is our 35th anniversary for hosting community luncheons to address topics of international interest. We certainly want to thank our members, our volunteers, our interns, our financial supporters for making these forums possible since 1983, which a little British politics here. That was the year Tony Blair was first elected to the House of Commons. And I want to acknowledge our financial and university and community supporters, including the University of Iowa International Programs, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Center for Public Policy, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their very generous financial support. And I thank today's special sponsors, Jim and Pat Epgrave and Mike Margolin. I also want to thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2, as well as the U of I Library's digital archives. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Janice Weiner, who will in turn introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out in such great numbers. My name's Janice Weiner. I'm also a member of the program committee of the ICFRC. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz. Rabbi Hugenholtz was born in Amsterdam, but spent most of her childhood in southern Spain. After completing her high school education, she moved back to the Netherlands, where she obtained her Master of Science in Cultural Anthropology and Sociology of Non-Western Societies from the University of Amsterdam. Furthering her Jewish education, she studied at the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem and was an Levinas Fellow at Paideia, the European Institute of Jewish Studies in Stockholm, Sweden. Rabbi Hugenholtz completed the first 2 years of her rabbinical training at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles, and then completed the remaining 3 years of her rabbinical training at the Leo Beck College in London in the UK, and was ordained a rabbi with this seminary in 2013. During this time, she experienced the process of Brexit as an EU citizen living in London. She then also served as an associate rabbi at a congregation in Leeds. As you can tell, she's a true internationalist and has been here now serving as the Rabbi of Agudas Achim since the last day of August of last year. She will be sharing her personal and philosophical thoughts from this period of time. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz.
My apologies. Like many of us, I've been struck down with something, so tea and tissues and water should do the job. It is an honor to be invited to speak here, and in order to get everyone's blood pumping with great enthusiasm, I'm going to talk about everyone's favorite book in the Bible, the Book of Leviticus. And I would like to draw your attention to this beautiful plaque on that far wall of the church, which says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And of course, this is from the Gospel of Mark, but of course, Jesus was a well-educated Jew, and he was citing Leviticus. Now, Leviticus as a book gets a bad rep, and rightly so. There's some gory stuff in the Book of Leviticus, but there's also some incredible stuff in the Book of Leviticus, in the section that we know in the Holiness Code, that literally sits in the heart of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And I just want to read to you in Hebrew, and then give the verse to you in English as my starting point for my remarks. And also to frame the conversation that first and foremost, I am a rabbi, and first and foremost, I am a Jew. And that is the lens through which I view the world. And that is the lens, the voice with which I speak. I am not an expert in international relations or foreign policy. I am just a person who has observed and experienced monumental shifts in the EU, including Great Britain. So the Book of Leviticus, going back to Leviticus, in chapter 19, 34 says, V'chi yagur itcha ger ba'artzachem lo tono oto. And if a foreigner will dwell with you in the land, do not oppress him. Ke'ezrach mikem, yeh lachem hagar. For like a citizen, he shall be who dwells with you. We are commanded to love the stranger. Jewish tradition ascribes this verse or this sentiment as being commanded to us 36 times. And biblical scholars actually say it was commanded in different guises 52 times. You shall love the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. Itchem va'ahavta lo kamocha, and you shall love the stranger like yourself. Ki garim haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim. For strangers you were in the land of Egypt. Ani Adonai Elohechem. I am the eternal your God. And this for me is the narrative that underscores my being in the world. Everything that I do and everything that I believe can be filtered through this one verse. And not just in a hypothetical philosophical way, because this is what I believe and those are my Jewish values, but because I am an immigrant. And I am counterculturally to current narrative in the world, I am damn proud to be an immigrant. And I cherish that identity, and I celebrate that identity, because it takes hard work and gumption and initiative and a wonderful support system in order to be a successful immigrant. And I will make no apologies for being an immigrant and for being a global citizen, and I have the Taurus backing to do that. So, what happens? I want to present two stories. One story is the slightly more boring one. It's about a story of facts. And the other story is about my experiences. It's the personal narrative. So, let's start with the facts first. And then hopefully we'll be rewarded with a little bit of juice at the end for some personal narrative. What is the EU? So, the European Union wasn't just an entity that materialized out of thin air. It had a number of stages since its inception. It is the political and economic union of 28 member states, and it has an estimated population of over 510 million citizens, which makes it the largest democratic body in the world. It has an internal single market with the so-called four freedoms of goods, services, capital, and persons, i.e. me, as set out by the Treaty of Rome on the 25th of March, 1957. And it's the Treaty of Rome that set up the European Economic Community that would eventually become the EU. And this is how I knew the entity when I was growing up as a kid. We called it the EEC, and then we had to kind of change it into the EU. The EU also enacts legislation in justice and home affairs and maintains common trade policies. And it has internally opened its borders within the so-called Schengen domain. And it has no passport controls. When I was a kid and I would drive from Spain, when I spent part of my childhood, to Holland, and we would traverse 3 to 4 different countries on our way, depending on our route, we would have to stop every time and show our passport and have dogs sniff out our car and have our stuff checked. And then one day, Schengen was enacted and we could just drive through. And I remember that moment very acutely, how beautiful it was. And not just practical, but morally beautiful, just to think that we are united in some way that goes actually beyond the formalities of border controls. And you really sense that when you travel, when you drive from one country to the next. At the Monetary Union, which was introduced in 2002 and is used by 19 member states. So there is no complete overlap between the member states and the people who are in the in the monetary union. Holland is in the monetary union, and I remember I was a student, a poor student, when the euro was introduced. And initially I was kind of excited because it was cool to have this euro that you could pay with everything everywhere. And it was very practical for me because I would visit my family in Spain all the time and I wouldn't have to switch currencies anymore. But then overnight, the prices doubled without an inflation correction for labor or wages or anything else. And I was a poor student to begin with, and I can tell you the next 6 months I lived on lentil soup. So there were some glitches and there were complaints from the common people about this sudden transition to the euro. In Holland, it basically doubled prices overnight, especially for food and consumer goods and services. And it took a while for wages and benefits and things to catch up. Eventually it did, and now we're used to it. But there is still a little bit of tension in some of the member states, especially with those with stronger economies, about the introduction of the single currency unit, also for economic reasons, but maybe I'll address that a little later. So the history of the EU came directly out of the experience of the Second World War. As you can imagine, Europe consolidated itself and decided we never want to go through such a harrowing, devastating experience again. And so the first iteration was formed in the 1950s through a number of European-wide organizations, among others, the European Economic Community, which I mentioned already, and this name was maintained for decades. And there were 6 founder member countries, including the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, and what was then West Germany and the Netherlands. And this core is still instrumental in determining the EU's ideological thrust. The EEC became the EU at the Treaty of Maastricht, that is how you say that city, or people will know it as Maastricht, in 1993, and introduced EU citizenship. At first there was talk of the ECU, or the ECU, the European Currency Unit, which eventually became the euro. On a personal note, I was in my early teens when these transitions happened, and I always had an inclination to the internationalist and the idealistic. And so I was actually really thrilled to see this happen. For me, this was almost like a messianic harbinger of peace to come and the stirrings of an increasingly unified and peaceful and prosperous world. I also saw directly what EU funds did to the region I was living in. I lived in Andalusia in Spain, which is quite an economically deprived area. Apart from a thin strip of tourism, it's a very agricultural region and one of the poorer regions in Spain. And the EU made sure that roads were built, that infrastructure was improved. We saw one road and one bridge and one building after another pop up with big blue signs with the 12 stars in the circle saying this project is funded by the European Union. And I saw how it pushed Spain into the next level of economic development. And I'm very grateful to the EU for doing that in the community that I was in. What does EU citizenship mean, and what does it actually give you? Well, the EU has 7.3% of the world's population, and depending on how you measure it, 22.2% of global nominal GDP. The EU has a very high human development index, and the EU as an entity was given a Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 and develops a common role in foreign, diplomatic, and military relations. Now, EU citizenship isn't true citizenship. The EU is not a country. It's not even a federation of states the way you would understand the United States to be a federation of states. And in that sense, you can't quite compare the EU to the USA. Also, it's too internally diverse to compare it to the USA, even though I fully acknowledge that America is incredibly internally diverse, and I look forward to experiencing more of that diversity as I spend time here. However, the EU citizenship does give you certain rights, the 4 freedoms that I mentioned, but also the right of free movement, settlement, and employment across the EU, including benefits and healthcare. So when I moved from Holland from America via Holland to Great Britain, I could just go to my local GP, as they call it in Britain, general practitioner, your family physician, and say, I just moved from the EU, and they're like, righty-ho, we'll sign you up, and Bob's your uncle. And you get free healthcare at the point of use. Right to trade goods, services, and capital with no restrictions. It's very easy to set up a business. My husband set up a business briefly in Great Britain, and it was a very seamless process. The right to vote and run as a candidate in local, not national elections. So when I was living in Britain, I voted in local elections always, but I would cast a ballot by proxy for the Dutch national elections. And the understanding is that you're vested in your local community, but you will still have allegiances to your country of origin, and it tries to balance those two interests. And the right to the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU and the EU Ombudsman. And now, there are 28 countries of the EU, and in order of joining, this is them. I wish I could do like a Tom Lehrer thing, but I can't. Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Denmark, Ireland, United Kingdom, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Austria, Finland, Sweden, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia. And I listed them in this order because it's relevant. It's relevant when it comes to examining some of these cultural shifts and perceptions about who has joined the EU most recently, to illustrate a kind of a north-south and the east-west split in terms of affiliation, and how that gets built up into a narrative of we who are the core of founder states, of founder countries, are economically strong. We have a strong civic culture. We have built up the EU through our blood, sweat, and tears. And now there are these more peripheral countries with sometimes complicated histories in terms of the democratic process that they have embraced over the years, who have come to join us. And that is important also in terms of exploring how Great Britain sees its EU membership. Now, the EU has a number of institutions, and this is also relevant because the institutions feel very remote to the average citizen, right? So it sounds very reasonable to have these institutions, but in people's day-to-day lives, they just feel like a bee moth. So there is the European Council and European Commission, which has a legislative function, and it's far removed from people's lives. If you'd ask the average European citizen what they do, they'd probably shrug their shoulders a little bit. The EU Parliament, which is like, you get to vote for the EU Parliament, and you're like, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, whatever. You know, I don't know these representatives. People tend to vote along party lines. That makes the most sense. Well, if I'm voting a conservative voter, I'll vote conservative for the European Parliament. If I'm a social democratic voter or a liberal voter, the same. But the EU Parliament is a very, very big entity. And you can just imagine what meetings are like. 751 directly elected representatives. So it can get pretty rowdy in there. And we vote them in a bicameral system like other modern democratic structures. But it cannot override national sovereignty. It cannot. And there's a lot of mythology about this, about the power of the EU. And impressively, it is the largest transnational democratic electorate in the world. It holds elections every 5 years. But given what I just said about people's feelings of detachment from the EU, it has very low voter turnout, less than 50%. Now, Britain's unique relationship with the EU. I remember when I moved to England, and I was in seminary there, and one of my professors said, well, Esther, you have to understand, you know, when there is a fog between the English Channel and, blocking England from Europe by the English Channel, the tabloids will run a headline that says, European continent cut off from Great Britain. Right? And I think that is kind of illustrative in a cute way how Europe is seen by Great Britain, and that the relationship between the two has been cordial, but at times tense as well. And there is skepticism and loads of bad jokes on both sides, especially the English and the French. I get that the Iowans and the Minnesotans make jokes about each other. It might be something like that, but I will stay far away from commenting on your local social dynamics. So England has this strange relationship. I'm using England as shorthand, which is incorrect. There are actual YouTube videos explaining why Great Britain is called the UK, why it's called the British Isles and England, and it is very complicated. I'll just use UK as shorthand. How about that? That's probably a little more scientific. So the UK has been part of the EU from the beginning, since 1951, but in a peripheral way, and has decided to hang back from many of its political involvements. It declined invitation to be part of the 6 founder nations at the Treaty of Rome. But, like anyone, I'm, not singling out any one country in particular, but after some economic decline, they started to realize which way their crumpet was buttered, and decided to engage more with the EU. And that trope is important. The economic aspect is important because with the Brexit-Referendum, that was a very important theme between the two camps vying for the vote. What would the economic impact be of the decision to stay or to remain? But ironically, the French, of course, through Charles de Gaulle, vetoed Britain's joining twice, citing, and I quote, deep-seated hostility. So, this goes back centuries. Europeans have long historical memories. The UK has historically always been an outward-facing country facing America, and really cherishes its historic bond with America, which is slightly ironic given what happened in 1776. But still, they really identify in some ways with the United States. So eventually, the UK decides to join in 1973. And ironically, the UK held a referendum in 1975 where a resounding 67% of voters voted in favor of joining the EU. And there's been an interesting switch. So initially, it was the conservative political camp who supported the EU project, and the Social Democratic or the Labour political camp who opposed the European project for very classic reasons. Free trade versus protection of workers' interests and rights. And then when the new Labour Party emerged under the leadership of Tony Blair, there was a switch where Eurosceptic factions in the Tory party, in the Conservative Party, started undercutting that conservative consensus, and the updating of the Labour Party in New Labour with a new ideological orientation, including a more positive view of free market policies, led to an embracing of the EU. But it is interesting that there is tension in both parties, and you actually saw that play out in the recent British election when Jeremy Corbyn was vying for leadership. He had to control and negotiate the Eurosceptic factions in his own Labour Party. And for us EU migrants who would usually rely, this is I hope it's not taken as a partisan comment. It's just a comment that comes from a place of enlightened self-interest, that you would align yourself more with the party that is likely to embrace international solidarity and immigrants' rights. And a lot of EU migrants have felt a little bit betrayed by the Labour Party's ambivalence under his current leadership. So there's a very interesting dynamic there. And it was actually the Liberal Democratic Party which got smashed in the last number of elections. They had a coalition government a few years ago, and they were seen as not being principled enough. And they actually stepped into the breach to become the vocal pro-EU party. It didn't give them electoral victory, but it was very interesting to see that vacuum open up in the political center and to see that party move into that vacuum. England's uneasy, or the UK's uneasy relationship with the EU came to a particular head with the formation of the UK Independence Party, also known as UKIP. An originally Eurosceptic party that was formed in 1993, achieved third place in the UK during the 2004 European elections for this huge parliament, European Parliament that I just mentioned, second place in the 2009 European elections, and first place in the 2014 European elections with 27.5% of the total vote. So it's ironic that the very body that they were critiquing was offering them a democratic voice in the European Parliament. And the party at that time was led by Nigel Farage, who dips in and out of party leadership. It's like a political soap opera. And unfortunately, what started initially as a Eurosceptic party, which is their every right to critically examine the European project and how power is negotiated in the European project, they became an increasingly xenophobic and anti-immigrant party. And I'll touch on that. In 2012, Prime Minister David Cameron did a very stupid thing by calling a referendum on EU membership as a bid to contain Tory divisions. You know, when you're not sure how something's going to play out, don't ask people's opinions. And that's what he did. And, you know, I think, you know, in the halls of Whitehall in the government, there was some smugness, dare I say, about the outcome of this referendum. They were convinced that people would vote to remain in the EU, and they had not kept their ear to the ground of what people were thinking in their constituencies and their daily life, and how both the reality of the EU affected people's lives, or how they didn't see how it affected people's lives, because the EU has improved people's lives in Britain greatly as well. And the mythology that was built up around, you know, issues of national identity, immigration, cultural shifts, and more existential issues of who we are in an increasingly globalized world. They completely underestimated that. So lo and behold, I watched all of this happen. And I came to England in 2010, and I lived in London for 2 years. And London is, you know, a bastion of pro-EU sentiment, and it's very multicultural. And I felt incredibly welcome there. It was never an issue. It never occurred to me. I had a very kind of European civic-minded approach. You know, I'm going to pay taxes in this country. That means I get to, you know, as a net contributor, I get to draw on the system as well. I enjoyed the services by the National Health Service. You know, I paid my council tax, and I went along my way quite merrily. Then I moved to the north of England, to Leeds, which is in Yorkshire, which was one of the Leave constituencies. Even though the city of Leeds voted to remain by a slim majority, the surrounding counties are more socially conservative, and they voted Leave. And things started really changing. So on the night of 23rd of June, I stayed up until about 2 a.m. watching the election, and it was a slim majority for Remain at that point, for the referendum. And I thought, oh, well, it's 2 a.m., enough already. I'm going to go to bed. I will wake up, I will still be in the EU, and it will be fine. And I wasn't super confident because it was a slim margin, but I too could not imagine the vote turning out the way it did. I woke up, I checked the news, and I was devastated, and I thought, oh my, what does this mean? What does this mean for my family? Because I had left England for 1 year to be with my husband. We were long distance for most of my rabbinical training. And I moved back to Holland for 1 year in my final year of rabbinical school because I could take classes by remote and fly into my student pulpits. And so I had severed what would have been 5 years of continual residency in Britain, which is what you need in order to apply for permanent status. So I knew that I had reset the clock by coming back in 2013 after I had my first child and after I was ordained, and that I had only been in the country for a couple of years by that definition, even though all in all I spent 7 years in the EU. And I noticed people pivoting. I noticed people pivoting culturally. So initially, when I came, no one would even consider asking me where I was from. I was just another European. Every shop, every cafe, every restaurant you walk into, you hear European accents. It wasn't even on people's minds. And all of a sudden, I started getting questions in the playground. Well, what language are you teaching your children? I said, I'm teaching them Dutch. Well, and why are you teaching them Dutch? Shouldn't you be teaching them English? It's like, well, they will be educated in English. They will be surrounded by English. I know a thing or two about language acquisition. I'm trying to lay down the Dutch before we start learning English, because otherwise they'll forget their Dutch and they'll never retain any Dutch. And this was met with some judgment and hostility. Now, one day, I was riding the bus. I got on the bus with my son, who was 3 at the time. And he wanted to look out the window, and, in England they have these double-story buses, so we went up to the higher story. And we snuggled in a corner, and I was just talking to him quietly in Dutch. These are the cars, and these are the trees, and these are the houses, and these are the shops. And there was an older gentleman sitting next to me who started eyeballing me a little bit. And then out of the blue, as I was minding my business for once, I'm not prone to minding my own business, that's why I make an excellent rabbi, he said, "You should speak English." And, I kind of looked at him and I was nonplussed. And I said, huh? It wasn't my most eloquent moment. He's like, you should speak English. You should speak English to your son. And then it clicked what he was referring to. And I said, what language I speak with my son is of no concern to yours, sir. All those foreigners coming into England, taking our jobs, blah, 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 blah. Your son should speak English. I don't recognize this country anymore. I don't recognize the languages spoken on the bus. So I said again, sir, it's really none of your concern what language I speak to my son. As you can hear, my English is fluent. I am an EU national. I work here. I pay national insurance. I pay tax. I make sure that you too have health care. And you have no right to talk to me like this. Well, I was in the Second World War, and we fought to keep all those foreigners out. And, I didn't even, I was so glad, I was so eager to say, I'm Jewish, but I thought, no need to kick the hornet's nest here. So I said, You know, my country was brutalized by 5 years of Nazi occupation. It is precisely for this reason why we need to be open-hearted towards immigrants and why we need the European Union. And this is a world that's changing, and you better deal with it, because this is the new world. So that was an unpleasant encounter, and it was very strange for a Western European, white, blonde, privileged, highly educated, middle-class woman to be racially abused, because that's what it was. He thought I was an Eastern European. He thought I was one of those Romanians, one of those Polish, one of those newcomers, and he tried to intimidate me. So I wasn't intimidated or rattled by the incident, but I was deeply saddened and I was quite cross, which is a British way to say very angry. Actually, it would be a little upset. Yeah. So I got off the bus, and some people, vocalized their support once I was off the bus. But it was a very good example, very exemplary example of how the dynamic had shifted. All of a sudden, taxi drivers started saying things like, "Well, love, you can stay. You're all right." Right? It's like, that's not the way we want to have this conversation. But I guess I kind of appreciate the sentiment, I guess. And I didn't feel welcome anymore. Now, there are 3 million EU citizens in Great Britain, and there are 1.5 million British citizens in the other 27 member states of the EU. And our populations are deeply entwined and deeply interwoven. And so what ended up happening is that, and this is also my main observation and also my main complaint about how the Brexit debacle played out, is that the government didn't manage to contain these tensions, these societal tensions. I think it's very fair to have a societal discussion about national sovereignty and globalization and border control. Those are things that merit discussion, and they merit an intelligent discussion. But the British government held off purposely to give us EU migrants the assurance that we could stay. And many of us felt that we were being used as chattel in negotiations, a tit for tat. The 3 million of us pitted against the 1.5 million of them. And ironically, in an act of international solidarity, these two groups started talking to each other through representatives, through organizations, and started saying, neither of us want to be treated like this. We are all committed to free movement of people in the EU, and neither of us want to be treated like this, and we stand to defend each other's interests. But in a way, Pandora's box had already been opened. Hate crimes surged in the wake of Brexit. Police figures that have been obtained showed that incidents surged by 23% in the 11 months after the EU referendum, compared with the same period the previous year. And that is an unparalleled rise. More than 14,000 hate crimes were recorded between July and September of 2016. And in 10 police forces, the number of suspected hate crimes increased by more than 50%. And some of these were deadly. There were a few attacks on Polish community centers and hateful language being littered around migrant homes and migrant cultural centers. And there was a Polish man who was actually killed by 6 young adults in the street. They kicked him to death. That is a hate crime. There's no doubt about it. No more Polish vermin cards were distributed. Racist fire attacks, graffiti, And that is not to mention the microaggressions and the little jarring comments and questions and criticisms, little barbs that you would experience in public life all of a sudden. It was clear. You weren't really welcome. Go home. And there was a breakdown of trust. The state apparatus of the British government didn't help, because there were more than 100 cases of the British Home Office, which is the equivalent of the State Department in this country, sending erroneous correspondence to EU nationals residing in Britain for decades, telling them to go home or else face deportation, including some of my own countrymen. Dutch people were told, you need to go home or face deportation. And, you know, there is a ludicrous quality to this, you know. You feel a cultural similarity. There's only the English Channel that separates your countries. You stood by each other in the Second World War, and all of a sudden you get a letter that you have to go home. But this is home. Mental health issues surged in the 3 million EU migrants. And I remember myself experiencing considerable stress, even though I knew I would move to the United States. There was also some anxiety around our visa as well. So that didn't help. But I remember feeling unmoored and feeling alienated and feeling deeply saddened for what I saw as the crumbling of this great European, civic, democratic, internationalist project that I wanted to believe in. 3 minutes. So I think this is part of a larger trend. This is not just about a Brexit referendum that took place on the 23rd of June 2016. In a way, we have to go back 15 years earlier, when the Twin Towers came down, in 9/11. And I know that in my own country, I know exactly where I was in 9/11, and all the more so for all you, it happened on your territory, in your country. And there was a real pivot in many of our European countries where populist, nativist, dare I say, xenophobic sentiments started taking root in what previously had been liberal democracies. And I saw that in my native Holland, and it broke my heart. I saw political parties rise that argued in favor of closing borders, who engaged in inflammatory rhetoric against immigrant populations, especially the Muslim community. Our local far-right politician, Geert Wilders, whom you may have heard of, but more likely pronounced as Geert Wilders, called for the banning of the Quran and for attacks on the hijab, and engaged in a concerted effort to shift the narrative on immigration in a very disturbing direction. I think people feel unmoored, and I think there's something bigger going on that is of an existential nature and perhaps even of a spiritual nature. And that is also why I opened with the Book of Leviticus. That was intentional. I think people feel lost. People feel unmoored from their national identities. People feel like through the economy of scale that we are experiencing in an ever-expanding world, that they no longer know who they are. Europe is a very secular continent. Now, I am all in favor of secularism. I quite like the separation of church and state. It works out well for Jews historically. But there's no denying that with that secularization has come the dismantling of communities, the dismantling of meaning and purpose. And that is a bold claim that I am allowed to make because I'm a theologian and I have to make some unsubstantiated claims. I base my career on it. There is something about a question that we have to ask ourselves on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean of who we are and how we want to move through the world and what it means to look in the face of the other, to say, Va'afta l'recha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Thank you, Jesus, for saying it again. For us to examine what our identity is. The British Prime Minister, Theresa May, who followed in the wake of David Cameron, whose government resigned, famously or infamously, according to me, said, people who consider themselves citizens of everywhere are citizens of nowhere. And I couldn't disagree more. I feel as an immigrant, I am so proud of having contributed to every society that I have been in. I feel like I've learned and cherished every culture that I have had the good fortune of having spent time in. And I miss England. Of course I do. There were many, many things to love and to cherish and to treasure about my years in England. And it would be very artificial for me to say that just because I feel slightly betrayed by at least 52% of the British population. I'll try not to make it personal. I still have very warm feelings about a country that received me, at least initially, with open arms. And I have come to America with the same good faith and the same goodwill to root myself in this society. And just because I do consider myself a citizen of everywhere doesn't mean I'm a citizen of nowhere. It means I'm a citizen of everywhere. It means that I am following in the line of the Hebrew prophets who envisioned a unified world without losing what makes us unique and what makes us distinct. We Jews are quite good at holding on to what makes us unique and distinct, and no one else understands. And that is not the concern here at all, but it is a concern that we have to find a balance between holding on to our national and local and cultural identities and always remember the words of Vayikra, of Leviticus, to love our neighbor as ourselves and to love the stranger as ourselves. Thank you.
We'll sort of group these as we can. The first one goes back a bit, I would say, in history. And the question is, please comment upon the notion that anti-Thatcher sentiment overcame enlightened economic self-interest in the Brexit vote.
Yes, especially in Yorkshire, where I lived. Yorkshire and Thatcher are not, very in love with each other. Thatcher was instrumental in effecting a number of economic changes that affected that region very much, including the closing of the mines. And yeah, there was like a kind of a blue collar, not just collar, but collar, see what I'm doing here, thrust to the argument of a beleaguered working class, or at least a self-perception of a beleaguered white working class who wanted to put a stop to globalization and go back to their interests. And that's also why the Labour Party has been ambivalent in its response. Instead of just saying, we are standing for the EU, we're standing for the migrants in our midst, that ambivalence comes because of that economic and historical reality.
And because we deal in difficult questions here, as a rabbi, how do you relate to Netanyahu's stand regarding expulsion of the Sudanese? You're allowed to not answer.
Many different Jewish organizations have called upon the Prime Minister, and I will align myself with the statements of the Reform Movement and other Jewish denominations and religious organizations that have called for a compassionate reevaluation of that policy, of course.
A sort of a factual question. Can you now, living and working in the U.S., vote in the EU and also for your country, the Netherlands?
Okay. Great. Nope. Once you're out, you're out. And if you have left the EU for more than 3 months, all your benefits entitlements lapse. So if I would have broken my leg between September and December, I could have flown back and gotten free healthcare in Britain. But once you have pulled back, your rights lapse. I am a Dutch citizenship. That's irrevocable. If I want to become an American citizen, about 20 years down the line or however long it takes, I would have to revoke my Dutch citizenship. But that's a unique feature to Holland. That's got nothing to do with the EU. I am a Dutch passport holder. I am, however, entitled to move to any of the other 27 states in the EU from America. If I want to move to Greece or Italy or France from America on the basis of my EU passport, I could. So those freedoms remain. But once and that was also some of the anxiety about my kind of migrant journey, is that I knew once I would leave England, I would surrender my right to be in England, because we are not sure what's going to happen once Article 50 is triggered in a year's time or so, and how that will affect things. So it's a big question mark what will happen.
And then I will combine the two last questions. Your experience post-Brexit referendum sounds in some ways very much like Trump's America. Is this a similarity that you feel, and do you have any concerns about your status here?
This is recorded, right? I think it's more important, if we're going to do diagnostics, to go to the underlying trends and recognizing that electoral outcomes are symptoms and not the causes. The causes run far deeper. And I think the causes overlap. That's why I made a point of saying in my conversations with both peoples on both sides of the Atlantic that this is not just an American phenomenon. It's not just a British phenomenon. It's not just a European phenomenon. It's happening in various parts of the developed world, and it does prompt us, those of us who feel that we do cherish international values, to ask ourselves honestly, what about our narrative is not compelling? And how can we take back the narrative and make it compelling again, so that we can face as a species the momentous problems that we are facing as a species, rather than atomized individuals or atomized countries? Am I afraid of my status? Look, I'm on a visa. Technically, the visa is valid for 2 years, and then it has to be renewed, and I have to enter into a complex process of solidifying my status. I am a privileged yet vulnerable migrant. That's how I describe myself. I am privileged. I'm of a certain ethnic background that is, easier to negotiate in this country. I'm Western European. I'm highly educated. I have too many degrees. So in that sense, I'm really privileged. But on the other hand, I am still an immigrant. And I will never, and this is the Torah's message that I try to inculcate on a daily basis. I pray to the Holy One of Blessing that my privilege may never blind me to having empathy and solidarity with those who don't have that privilege. So we'll see. And right now, I'm delighted to be here, and I feel very much welcomed in Iowa City and in the United States of America, and I hope that will remain for a good long time to come.
And so, Esther, as a small token of our appreciation, we have a mug for you to drink your British tea. It's very, very coveted, and we want to thank you so much for your time and generous thoughts with us today. And we are adjourned.
Thank you.